Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley has called for an extension of the current state of emergency, emphasizing the need for additional time to tackle the root causes of the current crisis.
In 1965, the GDP per capita of Trinidad and Tobago exceeded that of Singapore, and in 2014, it was higher than that of Estonia. Today, Singapore's GDP per capita is between 80 and 90,000 US dollars, accurate first quarter 2025. Estonia's is around 30,000, and Trinbago's is 18 to 20,000. These are exposed economies where nominal GDP is faithful to purchasing power, so these numbers are directly comparable. More than regression, I think we as a country, Trinidad and Tobago, have struggled to advance. We have had multiple resource booms, and we've squandered all. You could say it isn't the state's job to make people wealthy, but Trinbagonian governance is rather practiced at getting in the way. In 2018, Uber left Trinbago, citing the lack of an environment that supports innovation and technology. And in 2021, Trinbagonian-founded online payments company WePay moved its headquarters to Jamaica over the same issue and backwards red tape. More importantly, it is the state's job to enact justice. And according to the World Bank, it takes 1,340 days for Trinbagonian courts to enforce one contract, almost twice the Caribbean and Latin American average of 742 days. Compare Estonia at 455 and Singapore at 120. It is fair to say that our governments have been lacking or worse in their most basic responsibilities. Most critically, Trinbago's homicide rate in 2024 was 40.1 murders per 100,000 people for the year. Singapore's was 0.17 in 2024 and Estonia's was 2.4. And the most recent global average was 5.8. People often talk about the United States being violent, and their figure for 2023 was also 5.8. You know, in 2003, the murder rate in the smithereened and lawless land of Iraq was about 17. And in the ostensibly not smithereened Trinbago, it was also 17. We've been one of the most dangerous countries in the world since 2001, and mismanaged resources on top make a recipe for a state that isn't failed yet, but it's very precarious. To be forthright, this is because we, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, do not hold our governments to any kind of standard. Putting aside that our civil society organizations are slumpy and we don't donate much to them, we as voters do not punish malfeasance or incompetence. This isn't due to some inherent flaw, but getting to a systematic explanation of why we decide to act this way and how it plays out, I think is very useful for pointing out how we can change it.
Everyone's a little bit racist sometimes. Doesn't mean you go around committing hate crimes.
For a country with clean elections and a general military peace, a big part of our accountability issue is our racial politics problem. Notoriously, the country has two racial co-pluralities, Afro-Trinbagonians and Indo-Trinbagonians, each about 35% of the population. And though race relations in this country are fantastic compared to many others, when elections roll around, most people vote in manners predictable from their race. While that is not the same thing as people being racist, the consequences matter. We can speculate about ramifications about the median voter age being around 56, and how we tend to be psychologically most in tune to the world as it was when we're around 15 to 25, and how that affects contemporary racial perceptions. And I'm sure that those facts in particular are pertinent and important, but at the end of the day, changing the feelings that exist that are consistent with racial political polarization is a fool's errand. Indeed, it remains a fool's errand regardless of whether any of the people involved are racist.
Look, I don't believe you change hearts. I believe you change laws, you change allocation of resources, you change the way systems operate. You're not going to change every heart. You're not. But at the end of the day, we can do a whole lot to change some hearts and change some systems. And
look, a large fraction of the people who think that the PNM is good for everybody is Afro-Trinbagonian. And a large fraction of the people who think that the UNC is good for everybody is Indo-Trinbagonian. And none of these people have to be consciously racist for them to perpetuate political unaccountability. All they have to do to keep our government mired in a kiss of mediocrity is to think, accurately or otherwise, that they have no real choice between two good candidates. And if they are inclined to firmly dismiss one candidate, they will impose no real standards on the one that remains. Our specific electoral mechanics are another huge part of the problem. Trinbagonians directly elect 41 parliamentarians in 41 single winner seats. The winner is decided by first past the post. That is, there is just one round, and each voter makes just one vote for one candidate, and the winner is the person who gets the most votes after this one round. To start with one of the minor problems with this system, a large fraction of the valid votes in Trinidad and Tobago's 2020 election, 211,000 out of 658,000 voters, or 32%, did not vote for any candidate who won any office, and are denied representation for 5 years. With only 58% turnout, most of the country is unrepresented in government. Part of the problem with first past the post is that this result is typical. Much more importantly, this system alters how people vote and how parties behave. If you had at some hypothetical point 10 viable candidates for a seat, they'll average at no more than 10% each, and a candidate could easily win all of it with just 20% of the vote. So what happens in this hypothetical and subsequent elections is that people are discouraged from voting for more marginal candidates, and more marginal candidates are discouraged from running, and parties are discouraged from spending time and effort on more diverse sets of voters. It also becomes, from a rational perspective, a waste of effort for parties to campaign outside of their strongholds. First past the post entrenches tribalization. It is so famous for making two-party dominance in an electoral system inevitable. This phenomenon has a name: Duverger's law. Similar systems include the United States, where politics is increasingly polarized, and that corruption perceptions index is worsening.
People still say anyone would be better than Y. I'd prefer X to Y, I prefer Z to Y, anyone but Y. But because some people say, actually, yeah, maybe Z is the better of X and Z, now Y wins. So this violates independence of irrelevant alternatives, and also violates the majority loser criterion. So you can elect unpopular candidates. You can elect candidates who say, a majority of people say anyone but this candidate, and they can still win.
This is particularly true where ethnicity is concerned. The ACE Project for Electoral Knowledge at aceproject.org notes, in some situations, first past the post can encourage parties to base their campaigns and policy platforms on hostile conceptions of clan, ethnicity, race, or regionalism. In the Malawi multi-party elections of 1994, a history of colonial rule, missionary activity, and Hastings Banda's Chewaization of national culture combined to plant the seeds of regional conflict, which both dovetailed with and cut across preconceived ethnic boundaries. The South voted for the United Democratic Front of Bakili Maluzi, the Center for the Malawi Congress Party of Hastings Banda, and the North for the Alliance of Democracy led by Chakufwa Chihana. There was no incentive for parties to make appeals outside of their home region and cultural political base. Similar results have been observed in Fiji, Malaysia, and spectacularly Trinidad and Tobago. Compare the 2025 German federal elections, where voters just have 2 votes. The second vote making sure that most people have some kind of representation, even if they don't get a local representative that they voted for. And from just that little difference, there are 5 separate parties that can realistically push the direction of this year's German policy and governance. Another general game theoretic phenomenon about two-party democracies is that their policies will converge sometimes as they compete for specific interests at the expense of others, which then don't get representation. But the policies of the PNM and the UNC aren't really so much on track to converge as they're just the same. Duverger's law is weak in some countries, but extremely well exemplified in Trinbago. And this is because they both already primarily transmit one piece of information, racial information. And these parties don't need to compete on anything else.
Okay, this is it. Time to bring it all together.
So when you have 2 choices, and the choices have converged in policy, and they were already largely decided by race, so they're not differing in any other meaningful way. And your own opinion, if you are a Trinbagonian, is probably consistent with racial polarization, even if you don't think you're racist. For most people, there will be about 0 space in the vote-deciding set of possibilities to alter their decision on the basis of malfeasance, incompetence, or even ideology. This is not the only mechanic by which Trinbagonians have let our country get this bad. Electoral systems did not manufacture racism. History is complicated. But the first past the post is so insidious in its traps, so dangerous in the habits that it cultivates, and so perverse in the incentives it precipitates. We owe it to ourselves to end it. The Germans, the Irish, the North Irish, the Australians, the Kiwis, the Swiss, and the Swedish all have great systems that avoid this. By the way, the nonsense in the Trinbagonian system doesn't stop at Duverger's law. The last time a sitting legislator changed parties, in 2013, they were forced to undergo a by-election to keep their seat. And this represents an extraordinary amount of power that Trinbagonians ultimately put in the hands of party whips, officials in the parties who discipline members of the parliament by threatening not to fund their next electoral campaign or scuttling their pet interest bills. You would never hear about a party-forced by-election in a country like the US. And the party whips aren't weak there at all. In addition, we have a whole second legislative chamber that reinforces the power of the two most powerful elected people, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, allowing them to simply pick most of the senators, who then in turn have 29% of the vote on the next president. More than the vast majority of countries, the Trinbagonian constitution is built to be run by a continuing clique of 5 to 10 people organizing all of the real franchise in decision-making. We have made an art form of perverse incentives leading people to be unaccountable. This particular funny business with party power is why I would want to avoid direct party lists playing a constitutional role in any new system. There has been a lot of math on this subject called political economics and public choice theory in the last 60 years, but relatively little implementation of sound electoral systems.
Let me tell you about my country, Guyana.
Guyana is an example of a well-intentioned reform that is mechanically hazardous and generally underwhelming. From independence, Guyana has used a system of proportional representation instead of a previous first-past-the-post system. When voting for the National Assembly, their single-chamber sovereign parliament, voters vote in multi-seat local constituencies that are then offset by a single national 40-seat constituency. The local constituencies themselves assign 25 seats. The proportion of voters a party gets above a threshold is proportional to the number of seats that it gets in the National Assembly. But the curious flaw in the Guyanese system is that the voter can't vote for a specific candidate. They vote for a party list. They only vote for party lists. And these lists have a priority order set by party officials. If a party only gets one seat, it gets the top name on that seat. And voters have no control over this. So members of parliament can't realistically try to make conscience votes against or even to influence party whips. Like the Trinbagonian system, the Guyanese system enforces a very small clique of power. The concentration of party power, I think, is a large issue with the problems here. You are effectively voting for two small groups of party leaders, and they barely have any incentive to be accountable to the actual members of the legislature elected. But it is not difficult to design a system that functions better than these. I am so tempted to make one up and show you some original math on it, rather than rendering you one from scratch.
The record of history is absolutely crystal clear that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
Let me direct your attention to the system that evolved to benefit its voters more absolutely more directly and more empirically than almost any other in the world. And by that, I mean this is the system that is particularly associated with electing boards in for-profit companies. And it is mandated by law in corporate governance in 7 US states. Do note that its use is far more common than just there. It is called fractional voting. Fractional voting is applicable to multi-winner elections. Looking at Switzerland, one of the most transparent and well-run countries in the world, where every position of power is effectively multi-seat, yes, I think if we are going for a modern system of evidence-based governance, we should make every office, including the head of government and the head of state, multi-membered boards, just like the Swiss. So, to flesh it out, you, the voter, will have a large number of votes or vote fractions that you can decide to allocate to candidates as you see fit. Ideally, after a first round where you see which individual candidate has a surplus vote to win a seat, you pre-commit a proportional fraction to that best performing lock-in candidate, and at the same time, the ballot algorithm eliminates the worst performing candidate. And you either assign your votes automatically if your candidate is eliminated by algorithm, or if you don't trust algorithms, perhaps you have more voting rounds. This practically eliminates tactical voting. It eliminates the fear that you waste your vote on a possibly unpopular candidate because you can get to try them out. And if you have to have your vote reassigned, you can do so before the process is over. If you vote for a popular candidate, again, any excess can be reassigned. Even if Trinbagonians continue to have ethnically shaped perspectives and ethnically predictable votes, if there are at least 7 winners in every constituency, there will most likely be 3 winners of both plurality ethnicities in most constituencies, depending on distributional variation. And if there are 3 or more winners of one ethnicity, and voters are implicitly comparing them against each other, there are almost certainly going to be at least 4 people vying for those 3 psychologically implied subgroup of seats. That is, at least 1 excess candidate. No rule needs to define these subgroups. People's emergent behavior will make them. And if a voter is implicitly picking 3 out of 4 people, the voter can assess them on 2 dimensions. Think of it like quadrants. You have 2 candidates who are more competent than the other 2. And you have 2 candidates that are more ethical than the other 2. Conceivably, you end up with one of these 4 candidates being both less ethical and less competent. And voters who are thinking about, they have like 3 people they'll probably vote for, are going ideally to eliminate the person who is worse on both accounts. Well, worse on both accounts. You can eliminate the less competent, less ethical candidate with no feeling of racial anxiety and none of whatever unspoken anxiety motivates racially predictable voters. And this is how we construct a system that encourages candidates within a racial group to actively push for positive self-distinction regardless of party. It would certainly help with every decision problem mentioned here. We have 0 good reason to have fewer than 120 to 135 seats in the lower house. And we could do one better and have several independent elected chambers. one for the essential national executive, that is the army, foreign affairs and finance, maybe one more, or more than one, for the service wings of the executive, one for the core judiciary, maybe split out the sentencing process to a new separate branch of government, because judges rarely actually use legal skills or even concerns when sentencing, and it is truly more of a fit for behavioral economists than judges, and a separate elected body for an audit branch of government.
No matter how smart you are, and economists think they're pretty smart, you come up with some incentive scheme that you think is the perfect one to entice exactly the behavior you have in mind. And you set an army of people with nothing to do all day but to figure out how to beat that incentive scheme, and they absolutely.
So, though we might not be able to change feelings, we can probably change conditions, incentives, and behaviors. Corruption is a behavior. Enabling incompetence is a behavior. Looking the other way when mistakes are made is a behavior, and behaviors respond to incentives. Behaviors are often made by incentives. Changing culture is often a pipe dream. But the incentives subject to direct change are what we know as electoral law and ballot design, and that may require constitutional reform. As a preview for perhaps another project, I think it's really important to emphasize that countries with transparent and responsive government, like Switzerland, are usually countries with relatively autonomous local governments that manage their own finances and have real leverage in open quarrels with the central government. We are the furthest thing from that. But for now, please consider that if a politician does not support electoral reform in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago in 2025, or the constitutional reform it would take in this country, their concern for you is suspect, if not in its earnestness, then in its effectiveness and consequence. And it is consequences that matter,